In this video, I'm going to prove to you how physics can make you successful. And you're probably wondering, a guy with a whiteboard explaining what speed and velocity is. Let me explain, because within 1 year, I was able to basically get an internship at a Big Four just because I implemented velocity, not speed. Let's talk about this. If you guys know about Andrew Tate, he probably emphasizes the idea of speed and how important speed is to implement it in terms of your business, right? And so basically, in other words, speed will make you successful. Now, for the point of my video today, I would like to prove that it's not speed, it is actually velocity. So first and foremost, let's understand what is velocity in comparison to speed, right? As we learned in our primary school, speed is distance over time, right? Velocity is the change in distance over the change in time. So what is fundamentally the difference between speed and velocity? I want you to understand that speed is basically distance over time without a direction, right? So basically, you can be running in laps, you can be running in circles at a constant speed, and you might not be moving forward because you're basically running rounds, right? Velocity is when you add a direction. You can be running in a straight line in a specific amount of speed, and that will generate you velocity. Now, what is the difference? Because I want you to understand that in life, if you want to be successful, whether you're applying for a job or starting a business, everything is about progress. Because there's a crucial difference between process and activity. Now, you can spend hours in your business, you can spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day working hard on your business, but if you are essentially running laps, then there's not much progress, you're not moving forward, right? And so if you want to be successful in life, whether again it's in your business or whether you're working for a job, you need to make some type of progress. And progress is only achieved through velocity, because progress needs a direction. And that's the keyword, a direction. Velocity is when you essentially take a step forward. Like my previous example, velocity is a direction in time, right? Whether it's a straight line, whether you're going up, down, even backwards, that is considered velocity. The most important is there is a direction, right? So let's talk about this a little bit more in depth, right? What is progress, right? Progress at its metrical form, when you track it, is basically you measuring how much distance you have made forwards and or / backwards, right? Because progress is basically a change in time, right? From you going from one place, from A to point B. In today's amazing example, I will use Napoleon Bonaparte as a perfect analogy of someone who has not only demonstrated velocity in the physical sense, but actually demonstrated as a core principle of his battle tactic. Now, for the ones who don't know Napoleon Bonaparte, he was basically a French emperor or conqueror who, in my opinion, has dominated most of Europe in the 17th to 18th century. He basically reshaped the European continent in the way that France is, basically in different pieces, especially before World War I, but less about the history, more about his strategy and the idea of velocity, right? But before that, now that I'm looking at my whiteboard, I want you guys to understand that, again, constant velocity is a consistent speed plus straight line. You can be driving a car 120 km/h in a straight line and you will reach a constant velocity. Remember that. You are still moving forward constantly, right? The difference is, in speed, you can be running in laps, but not in a direction. You can be going in circles and circles and circles, just as you're doing your activities that are perhaps mundane and useless, and you might not be moving forward, right? So just understand that for now. So let's talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. If you study Napoleon Bonaparte's battle tactics, then you will understand that the reason he was absolutely successful, and I mean absolutely successful, is because his core principle of battle was literally velocity. He literally made sure that his army was absolutely quick. Whether it's, the cavalry just going straight to the cannons, how it was back then, or whether it was to actually mobilizing his men together or moving from one location to location B. The point is Napoleon Bonaparte utilized velocity at its core for the majority of his battle tactics. How did he do it? I want you to understand the first thing that he made sure was that he made sure that the people that contributed to velocity, right? Because you need to understand that velocity, there are a lot of factors that influence velocity, right? In the physics sense, obviously there's distance, time, change in distance, change in time. But for Napoleon Bonaparte's tactic, velocity was concerned about his army, right? And so in order for his army to be very quickly, right, in the sense, is he had to make sure that first of all, his entire army was focusing on the same goal. And that was very important because there was a difference between France's and Napoleon's army. Napoleon was a person who basically leveled with his men very well. His army respected him very well. His army treated him like literally a friend, and if not the other way around. And so because his army had that amount of respect towards him, they basically eyed to eye on the same goal. And why is eyeing to eye on the same goal very important is because when it comes to communication, Napoleon's vision is much quicker to execute than with an army who doesn't have the same goal. And that comes back to the idea of velocity, because we assume, and we don't assume, we know that Napoleon conquered most of the territory with quick battle tactics, right? And in order for his army to understand the quick and speed of his battle tactics, it is essential that communications was clear, because he had a massive army, right? He had above, I think, more than 130,000 at one point during the invasion of Russia. I believe it was more than 100,000 people. How do you manage such a big amount of people? And that's because you all have to be in the same goal. And when you're in the same goal, communication just becomes much better. Why? Because if communication doesn't work, there's more friction, and with more friction, you slow down, right? Not only in physics, but also in real life, right? And so there are reports of his army, one division of his army, running or marching in that manner 50 miles in just 36 hours. And that's crazy, because you have to understand that back then they had to carry the heavy wagons, the cannons, that heavy armor, mobilizing was slow, and then there was the entire supply chain. So 50 miles in 36 hours for an example of one division of his army is absolutely crazy. You can literally research this, and this is absolutely legit. So because Napoleon was able to basically obviously there were other factors in place, right, when it comes to velocity, but for the sake of this video, I'll just keep it very simple. Because he was able to maximize these things, very well, Napoleon's velocity was absolutely absurd. Very, very quickly. And not only Napoleon, guys, like if you look through battle, tactics in history, even Adolf Hitler himself, the Blitzkrieg, literally called the Blitz, which in German translates to lightning, right? Hitler himself also implemented such a strategy that, emphasized on speed and resilience. But let's not talk about him, let's talk about Napoleon, right? So, let's look at this. Downsides, right? This is the point I wanted to go to. So, regarding velocity, right, the next question might be, then, okay, now that you understand why velocity is important, because you want to, achieve your target quicker, you want to complete a task, much faster, you want to be ahead of an enemy, etc., etc. Once we understood that velocity is important, the next question is, how do I make sure I don't slow down? Quite frankly, the opposite, right? Because we know that factors contribute to velocity, but what are the stuff that limit velocity? And so in physics, the thing that influences velocity a lot is the mass, so how big something is, right? Because if you imagine, if you want to launch, let's say, a rocket ship to space that, I don't know, measures, let's say, like 1,000,000 tons, I don't know if that's even accurate, then you need a lot of, propulsion, you need a lot of force, especially ground force, to actually like launch this rocket, right? So you need a lot of energy, right? And so the same thing was with Napoleon's army, because Napoleon had an army of more than 100,000 soldiers. And so because his army was so big, he need to further maximize these parts, right? So it either goes two ways. Either you decrease the mass, right? Decrease the volume, decrease the size, or you increase the outputs that contribute positively to velocity, which is the same goal. Maybe communication is improved, maybe supply chains are improved, maybe, I don't know, like in today's world, automation sequences are improved. The issues Napoleon lost in Russia was because his army was more than 100,000 soldiers, and they had to travel a crazy amount of distance all the way through the winters and deep territories of Russia, right? And so because there was such a vast distance, right, coming back to the equation, you see the distance, because the distance was so high, velocity obviously slowed down. And so actually by the end of his campaign, to your information, he eventually retreated, he got exiled, and basically his reputation was damaged, and the French politicians or the people in charge back then, they were like, listen man, like this was too, because I think he lost around, I would say 60 to 70% of his army during that time. And so they actually exiled him. And so what we can learn from that is that velocity is important as long as you can contain and maintain it. You need to understand the mass of your army, as well as you need to realize the distance of the goal, right? The point A to point B, okay? And so a few more things before we wrap up this video on why Napoleon was, focused on velocity and why he did it so well, is because he was a territory expert. Napoleon realized in order for him to go from point A to point B, he needed to heavily rely on the routes, on the roads that would travel his cavalry, his cannons, his army, etc., etc. And to his luck, back then the roads were very well organized. Perhaps these were factors outside of his control, but in his control, he actually studied very well the geography of Italy and geography of France, as well as other regions in Europe, which allowed him to navigate through the complexities of the geography. And so he was basically a territory expert. And as I mentioned earlier, those were the factors affecting velocity, right? So he studied geography and history and many other things that would basically contribute to the idea of velocity. Now, I don't want to expand too much on this idea, but I hope that you understand the point that velocity is firstly fundamentally different to speed. And with velocity, you can win battles, you can be successful, you can start a business, and basically succeed in all metrics in life. So understand this point, and if you like this video, subscribe. If not, I'll see you in the next one.